Mary Jane Watson is a name that you probably know, even if you don't know Spider-Man. Like Lois Lane before her, she has become cemented in pop culture as the romantic partner of the red and blue superhero that everyone loves. But, since you're here, and since you probably do follow Spider-Man at least a little bit, you've probably seen her as the love interest in something recently. Whether it's Zoe Kravitz in Into the Spider-Verse, or Laura Bailey in the Spider-Man video game, or Kirsten Dunst in Spider-Man, or Zendaya switching out Mary for Michelle in the MCU Home Trilogy, or that cartoon series, or that other cartoon series, or that third cartoon series, or that other cartoon series, or the other cartoon series, or the other cartoon series. Or maybe you're old enough, like me, that you grew up with them married in the comics, all through the 90s and the early 2000s. You know, when she wasn't dead. But MJ's story is one that is known in fragments and vagaries. People know that Peter and Mary Jane are soulmates, but the story of how they got there doesn't really get told. For most people, her pre-marriage life boiled down to 4 events. She appears with the iconic "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot." She consoles Peter after the death of his girlfriend with an iconic close of the door. She bids farewell to Peter at the airport with an iconic kiss. And then she marries Peter in an iconic annual. Every big History of Mary Jane video or article will cover these 4 moments, usually briefly and on the way to explore the wedding and married life and their infernal divorce. But her first appearance was in 1966, and they got married in 1987. So there were 21 years and over 1,000 comic book stories in between that confident opener and the kiss that sealed the marriage. And a lot more than a door close and an airport kiss happened. So let's take a moment to go back to those pre-marriage days and discover the forgotten history of Mary Jane Watson. Let's explore the girl who wasn't always the soulmate, the girl who wasn't quite defined, the girl who wasn't yet the Mary Jane Watson that we know today. While Mary Jane was first revealed in all her glory in Amazing Spider-Man issue 42, she was first mentioned back in issue 15. Peter's Aunt May wanted to set him up with the niece of her friend, and she remained this tease for 2 years. Peter assumed that an aunt-approved blind date was going to mean a dowdy girl, and the punchline was that she was anything but. In fact, she was a breath of fresh air. She was bright and flirty, and, in direct contrast to all the other girls in Peter's life, she was excited by the danger of a Spider-Man lifestyle, and didn't mind Peter disappearing on her or cancelling dates. After all, there was always something else to do. However, after an initial flirtation, Mary Jane's narrative role in those early days becomes a love rival for Peter Parker's affections. You see, at the time that Mary Jane arrived on the scene, the main girl in Peter's life was Gwen Stacy, a classmate of his. Gwen was a girl that Peter had a crush on, who he thought was too beautiful to give him the time of day. And meanwhile, Gwen had a crush on Peter, but thought that he didn't care for her because he was aloof and too busy all of the time, what with being Spider-Man and with an aunt on death's door every month. They were 2 ships in the night, a tangle of missed connections. So into this mess comes Mary Jane Watson, suddenly arm in arm with Peter, and she becomes the catalyst for Gwen to finally take action. Gwen's style changes, moving away from Ditko's hair clips into mini dresses and hairbands, and she's dancing and flirting and fun. As John Romita, the artist at the time, put it,
"Pretty soon, it was hard to tell Gwen and Mary Jane apart. They were like Betty and Veronica, the same girl, except for the hair color."
And that's how it was for the next year or so. In between supervillain clashes, Peter would spend time with both bubbly airhead Mary Jane Watson and socialite Gwen Stacy, and the 2 girls would take playful jabs at one another, and Peter would refuse to commit to either one. But a decision needed to happen, and after 18 issues, Peter Parker officially chose Gwen. The choice seemed inevitable looking back. Gwen Stacy was Stan Lee's favourite, and who he considered Peter's true love. Gwen's change in style and the miniskirts were at the direction of Stan Lee. He was worried that Romita preferred drawing MJ and wanted Gwen to compete. As Jerry Conway, who took over as writer when Lee left, put it in Marvel Comics' The Untold Story,
"It was basically Stan fulfilling Stan's own fantasy. Stan married a woman who was pretty much a babe, Joan Lee was a very attractive blonde who is obviously Stan's ideal female. And I think Gwen was simply Stan replicating his wife, just like Sue Storm was a replication of his wife. And that's where his blind spot was.
How could Mary Jane Watson cope against the writer's own wife? Even just 3 issues after her arrival, Peter Parker begins to doubt his feelings for MJ. In Amazing Spider-Man issue 45, he's thinking,
"That chick's as pretty as a pumpkin seed, and about as shallow. I never realized how icky it can be. Listen to a gal who's on all the time."
And an issue later, he's fawning over Gwen's beauty. Even with a bombshell like MJ in the picture, he's still not satisfied. So while there was a question, textually, over who Peter would pick, even these early issues, 3 issues in, we're seeing the groundwork for the inevitable conclusion. He wasn't going to be choosing Mary Jane Watson. Not while Stan Lee was writing. Even if, due to MJ's popularity with the fans, Stan had to physically remove her from the comics for a whole year, which is exactly what he did. A year later, when Mary Jane came back to the comics, it was as a love interest to Peter's friend Harry Osborn, but she came back with a mean streak. Now, this development didn't come out of nowhere. Even in her early days, as she embraced her airheadedness, she showed insensitivities. In issue 49, for example, while Peter laid ill in bed, Mary Jane decided that she wanted to use that moment to play loud music and dance while in the same apartment. She needed Gwen to tell her that maybe that wasn't the kindest thing to do. Later, in issue 61, as Harry is fretting about Peter and Gwen being missing, she dismisses his worries and is more concerned with getting the money that she's owed for dancing than about her missing friends. But while these moments are careless or insensitive, the Mary Jane Watson who dated Harry read as cruel and uncaring. For example, the first time we see them on a date, Mary Jane has invited Harry and her friends to see her in a show, and Harry has invited his dad. As they gather in the front of the theatre, MJ pulls Peter away to flirt with him, ignoring her date and undercutting Harry in front of his dad. That was a big moment for him, and instead she spends the time flirting with an already attached Peter. The next day, when Harry, her boyfriend, and Peter bump into her at college, she immediately moves to Peter again, complimenting his clothes and pulling him away. Peter angrily rebuffs her and tells her that she means a lot to Harry, but it's too late. You see, it's during this time that Harry is battling a drug addiction. Feeling inferior in the eyes of his father or next to Peter Parker, or whenever he's with Mary Jane, he's turning to pills to make himself feel better. And it's pills he turns to when she chooses Peter once more. And so he's high when they meet later, and when she breaks up with him. The breakup is a harsh one. There's no care to her words. She dismisses him as only good for a few laughs and calls him Curly. You know, like one of the Three Stooges. She's smiling when she does this, and then she's out of his life. And Harry overdoses and goes into hospital. Now, to be very clear and explicit, drug abuse is a very complex thing, even fictional drug abuse, and I am no way suggesting that her words are responsible for his actions. They were harsh words and they were intended to wound, but there would always be reasons that he would have to take drugs. However, the comics never show her feeling remorse for her words. They never show her battling the feeling that she should have been kinder. The next time we see her is 8 issues later, at a welcome back party for Harry, who is returning from the hospital. And as they wait for Harry to come home, she's flirting with Peter again, while Gwen stands beside him. She's no longer dating Harry at this point, but to do this at his coming home party feels tasteless. But that is who Mary Jane becomes whenever she appears in the comic during this period. She's the tasteless flirt, aggressively hitting on Peter whenever they interact, in a way that would feel deeply uncomfortable if the roles were reversed. She's the girl who isn't kind, who's just there to have a good time at the expense of whoever gets in the way of that. And then Stan Lee leaves the book. And then Gwen Stacy dies. And everything changes. While I won't dwell on this moment because it's been covered in every history of Mary Jane and is the opposite of forgotten, the turning point for Mary Jane comes in issue 122 in 1973. It's the issue after Gwen Stacy's death, who fell from a bridge as Spider-Man battled the Green Goblin. Peter is in mourning, and MJ comes in to check on him, and Peter snaps.
Don't make me laugh, Mary Jane. You wouldn't be sorry if your own mother died. What do you care about straights like me and Gwen? Go on, get out of here. I know you hate sickbeds, and believe me, I wouldn't want to spoil your fun.
In that moment, he is addressing the Mary Jane that she has become, the uncaring party girl who was there to flirt with taken men and little else, the girl who valued a fun night out over the well-being of her friends. It was Conway distilling that character into one emotional outburst and then taking a moment to change her forever. Because Mary Jane Watson doesn't leave in that moment. She goes to the door and she shuts it, and she stays with a mourning Peter throughout the night. In that moment, her character irrevocably changed. Even when her character returned to type later, spoilers, she would always be the girl that stayed that night, who was there for Peter. As Mark Chinocchio put it in his Chasing Amazing blog,
we never truly know what is said between Peter and MJ in this scene. I'm going to speculate that it was a whole lot of silence, but judging by how the two interacted going forward, it was clear that MJ stayed and comforted Peter through all of it. MJ went from "face it, Tiger, you hit the jackpot" bravado to stoic, matriarchal comforter. It's the strongest I've ever seen a woman, not named Aunt May, act around Peter.
Most histories of Mary Jane consider this the starting point of their relationship, and usually they skip ahead to the wedding 14 years later. They might stop temporarily to mention their first kiss in an airport before Peter gets on a plane to fly to Paris to rescue a kidnapped J. Jonah Jameson. And it is a very good kiss. But the truth is that the door click is the start of a relationship, not the relationship. And that for the next 5 years, Peter is dating MJ without that meaning much. She mostly exists during this period as a plot device, someone that Peter is late to meet, or someone that he can worry about in his guiltiest moments. The reason that most histories skip over this period is because nothing of consequence happens between the two of them. They simply exist as a couple. Then, in 1978, Peter Parker proposes. Now, you may be thinking back to the beginning of this video and remembering that the two got married in 1987. You might be thinking that I just got my 7s and my 8s confused. But the truth is that Peter Parker first proposed to Mary Jane in 1978, after his aunt ends up in hospital again and talks about how much she and Ben loved each other and how she wished that Peter had the same thing in his life. And so he proposes with a crackerjack ring. And an issue later, Mary Jane says no. And then she leaves. She doesn't just reject Peter's proposal. She walks out of the relationship and out of his life, smiling as she breaks his heart. She does all of this in the hospital waiting room, after Peter just found out that his aunt has been moved to the critical ward. She is, once again, that callous and selfish Mary Jane that she was trying to move beyond. The next time we see her, she's dating a random guy called Brad Davis, seemingly moved on from Peter in a matter of weeks. Then, when he fails to turn up to a meeting with her and attempt to rekindle, she simply leaves. She leaves the city and the comic book. For 4 real-world years, between 1979 and 1983, she is simply not there. During these years, Peter Parker dated 3 other women: Sissy Ironwood, Deborah Whitman, and Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat, and had flings with Black Widow and an alien called Marcy Kane. You know, because comics. He didn't brood over Mary Jane during this time, and she was barely a presence in the book. For a girl who would go on to be Peter Parker's true love, she simply wasn't around. There were over 300 comic book stories featuring Spider-Man between when she left and when she returned. And when she did return, in 1983, Peter was in a committed relationship with Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat. When people consider the closing of the door the beginning of the relationship and skip straight ahead to the wedding, they're ignoring that Mary Jane is just not in the comic for a significant amount of time. And that, most importantly, she would never return to the role of Peter's girlfriend. During most of the early 80s, Peter is in an on-again, off-again relationship with Felicia Hardy. This often gets simplified to her liking Spider-Man, but hating Peter Parker, and while this is a hurdle when they first date, it's something that she gets over fairly quickly. They are, by all accounts, a dysfunctional but happy couple, eventually. She's the first woman that Peter Parker reveals his identity to, although technically he reveals his identity to Deborah Whitman to convince her that she isn't crazy and she refuses to believe him, but that's a long story. His relationship with Felicia Hardy makes Peter so euphoric that he skips into exams and nails the grade. And when Mary Jane returned into his life, it was to play that first part that she ever played, love rival. It was also during this time that she revealed a deep secret to Peter, that she had always known that he was Spider-Man, after seeing him slip out of a window one night when they were teens. It's an effective retcon. It makes very little sense based on the things that Mary Jane has done and said in the last 2 decades, but it feels emotionally true. It adds depth to her character and starts to explain why she acted the way that she once did. She was afraid to get close to Peter Parker because of Spider-Man. The next few years are spent as Peter Parker's friend. She helps him refurbish his apartment when his building catches on fire. She's there to be catty when Felicia is around. And every now and then, she'll have a thought about maybe talking to Peter about how she feels. But she's never sure. She loves Peter, she really does, but how can she love someone who will risk his life as a superhero every day? And so, nothing ever comes of her thoughts. And sometimes Peter will have thoughts too, but Mary Jane has already turned him down once, and so he almost never acts on those thoughts either. With the exception of this one kiss that they share before Peter regrets it instantly, travels to Germany, kills a woman, and then returns home to apologise for kissing Mary Jane, because comics. Peter Parker's main relationship at the time is with Black Cat. Sure, sometimes she's cursed with bad luck that only affects Spider-Man, and sure, sometimes he casts spells with Doctor Strange that strip her of her powers when she's least expecting it, but they are the couple, with no hint that anything would come between them. And so it would have been a surprise for anybody reading at the time to read an issue where Peter Parker was dating the Black Cat, an issue that implied that he took her to bed at the end. And then an issue later, you would read a story in which Peter suddenly proposes to Mary Jane. Because yes, he proposes again, with no reference to his relationship to Black Cat, and no reference to the fact that he and Mary Jane haven't dated in 8 years. And this time, she says no again. She says no, because she wasn't sure. But she got over it pretty quickly, because she had to. You see, the reason for the surprise proposal was behind the scenes drama. The wedding itself could be a whole video, but the short version is that Stan Lee and Jim Shooter, who was the Marvel editor-in-chief at the time, were taking fan questions at Chicago Comic-Con when they were asked if Peter would ever get married. Stan Lee put Shooter on the spot, and Shooter said yes. Fans got excited, and they had to work out the logistics from there. The logistics required, as future Spider-Man artist Eric Larson put it, that
in the span of 4 issues, they went from not even dating to being married. It seemed forced, and it was, to coincide with the wedding in the newspaper strip.
Oh yeah, there was a newspaper strip. From 1977, Stan Lee started a Spider-Man newspaper strip. And because MJ was the love interest in the comics at that time, she became the one and only love interest in the newspaper strip too. And as Larson says, Stan Lee wanted the marriage to happen in both the newspaper strip that he wrote and the comic book at the same time, regardless of whether Peter was with Mary Jane in continuity. It was a move that led to editors and writers being fired, and like I said, a much longer video. But Jim Salicrup, the editor of Amazing Spider-Man at the time, summed it up like this.
What I didn't fully understand at the time was how fast Stan wanted the wedding to happen. I was hoping we'd have at least a year or so to build up to it, but I was wrong. I should have known Stan is the most impatient guy in the world, so if he was asking, it was because it was going to be the next storyline. When Jim told me roughly when Stan was planning for it to happen, I nearly had a heart attack.
And so we reach the end of our story. Mary Jane married Peter Parker, and decades later, people have forgotten all of the drama that led up to it. Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson were simply a couple, from the close of a door until the I do, and all the ups and downs and other women are forgotten in the noise. While the Raimi movie adaptation and the 90s TV show helped cement MJ as the one true love of Peter Parker, I believe that one of the main reasons that this relationship really stood the test of time, after a rough start, was that the first post-wedding story was Kraven's Last Hunt, one of the better Spider-Man stories which hinges on the love between MJ and Peter. Like Mary Jane's retcon about knowing Spider-Man's identity all along, Kraven's Last Hunt doesn't make logical sense based on the events that we've seen build up to it. But it feels real, and it feels right. And feelings matter. But why talk about Mary Jane's history at all? If you exist in the Spidey fandom online, you'll understand that MJ is a contentious topic. Whole lists have been created to highlight any comic book creator that has said anything that can be perceived as negative about this fictional relationship, and people have sworn off ever reading Spider-Man again unless they're together. But I wanted to talk about the myth of Mary Jane as the one true love of Peter Parker, as if they were always written to be together. It's a myth created by the issues people grew up on and reinforced by adaptations, and it downgrades exactly who Mary Jane Watson is. Peter Parker was never meant to end up with Mary Jane, and that's great. Because one of the joys of comics is that they are these large-scale improvisational collaborations. One character is shared across many authors. New writers and new artists take over a series and take it into a new direction. Even each issue has artists and writers and letterers and colorists and editors all bringing a voice to Spider-Man and his friends. Mary Jane was not created to fall in love with Peter. She was comic relief, a brief dalliance on the way to true romance. But people fell in love with her, and even though she was unchosen or unkind or simply not present, she found her way back to Parker's side, time and again. David Crow, in an article for Den of Geeks, sums it up.
There is something charming about how these characters were never supposed to do anything more than flirt. But with almost will of their own, they kept growing and moving toward each other until Stan Lee finally forced Marvel's hand and had them married in 1987.
Even within the story of Spider-Man, outside of the creative decisions, we don't have a tale of true love. We have two broken people who found each other again and again. Mary Jane was there when Peter was grieving, and Peter was there to help Mary Jane cope with family issues. The writer of that first closed door, Jerry Conway, explains it like this.
It made no sense to me that Peter Parker would end up with a babe like Gwen who had no problems. Only a damaged person would end up with a damaged guy like Peter Parker.
And so they were damaged people, helping each other mend. Their love endured not because it was destined or true, or to produce devil-killing offspring. Don't ask. It endured because they put the work in, and they kept finding each other against the odds. At least that's the story, the past, that I wish people remembered. Thank you for watching and exploring Mary Jane's forgotten history. If you saw me tease the release of this video back in February, thank you for your patience. Thanks to anybody who gave me feedback on this video at all the various stages that I needed reassurance. And I also want to say thank you to all the people who agreed to read the quotes, for lending me your time and your voices. You'll find a link to all their channels below in the description. If you'd like to see more videos like this, or want to follow me on the journey to read every Spider-Man ever, please subscribe below. I've got lots of ideas for new videos in the new year. If you want to support what I do, I also have a Patreon, also linked below in the description. Once again, thank you for joining me. Have a lovely day, and I'll see you next time.